She was the assistant no one really noticed. He was the millionaire CEO everyone feared. For 2 years, Claire Whitman showed up quietly, did her job flawlessly, and disappeared before anyone could ask more than her name. But one brief slip, just a second, was all it took to unravel the wall she had built around herself. A tattoo, a glance, a question never asked aloud. Why did a man like Grant Maddox, a man known for power and precision, suddenly stop and truly see her? Was it fate, timing, or something she never dared believe she deserved? As seasons passed, whispers turned into rumors. Silence turned into a story neither of them could control. And through it all, two people who were never meant to fall into each other's lives found themselves standing at a crossroad. Is it possible for one moment to change everything? Can a woman who's been invisible for years finally learn to be seen? And if someone sees you fully flaws, fears, and all, do you dare believe them enough to stay? If these questions touch something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin the story of She Only Bent Down for a Second Awake. But in that second, everything she'd tried to hide was suddenly seen. It was the kind of morning that made you believe in starting over. Late October in Colorado, springs painted the city in amber tones, and the crisp air carried a hush that even rush hour couldn't break. At 8:02 a.m. exactly, Claire Whitman stepped into the lobby of the Hamilton building, her pace unhurried, her presence unnoticed just the way she preferred it. She had walked this path every weekday for the past 2 years through the glass doors, past the front desk where the security guard nodded but never asked her name, and toward elevator B, the one that always arrived last, but made fewer stops. She liked it that way. No conversations, no glances, no expectations. Claire was dressed in a modest navy skirt and soft cream sweater, both pressed with care the night before. Her hair, always pulled into a low bun, was tidy, intentional. She held her thermos with one hand, her phone in the other, tapping out a reminder for her son's dentist appointment when the elevator dinged and opened its silver mouth. She stepped inside alone and pressed the button for the 24th floor. The elevator doors began to close with their familiar, whisper-soft slide until a hand reached in. The doors reopened. He stepped in. Grant Maddox. Claire didn't look up. She didn't have to. There was something unmistakable about the way the air shifted when he was near, colder, sharper like mountain wind through pine. His presence carried the kind of silence that people didn't interrupt. He stood a few feet behind her, tall and still in his charcoal coat, his cologne subtle but grounding. Claire's breath slowed. She focused on the lighted floor numbers above the door, as if willing them to move faster. Then her phone buzzed. Startled, it slipped from her fingers, bouncing once against her heel before landing face down on the elevator floor. Claire bent down quickly to retrieve it, and in that motion, unnoticed by her, the hem of her skirt shifted ever so slightly. It caught on the edge of her heel, revealing just enough skin to show the small, faded tattoo near her left ankle. 5 words. You are more than what they see. By the time she stood up, the fabric had fallen back into place. But not before his eyes caught it. He hadn't moved, not a breath, not a word. But something in the air between them changed. She felt it in the quiet that followed. It was heavier now, warmer, somehow. Claire clutched her phone tighter, refusing to glance behind her. Her cheeks burned in a way they hadn't in years. The elevator kept rising, 20, 21, 22. She could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing behind her, not fast, not slow, just aware. When the doors opened on the 24th floor, she stepped out quickly, smoothing the front of her skirt without realizing it. Her usual path down the hallway felt different now, like walking through still water. She didn't look back, but she didn't need to. He followed, a few paces behind. There were no words exchanged, no acknowledgement, but something had passed between them. A glimpse, a moment, and Claire, who had spent so much of her adult life trying to blend in, suddenly felt seen. The rest of the morning tried its best to pull her back into routine. Her inbox overflowed, Her to-do list blinked at her impatiently. She answered phone calls, scheduled meetings, organized documents with her usual precision, but she couldn't shake the feeling. Not because of what he'd seen, but because of how he'd looked, not startled, not judging, not even curious, just present. The mid-morning team meeting was routine quarterly projections, sustainability goals, a dozen voices tossing numbers into the air. Claire sat at the long conference table, taking notes as usual, her pen moving on autopilot. And then she felt it again, his gaze. She looked up, briefly, across the table. He was watching her, not intensely, not boldly, but with that same quiet attentiveness that said he had remembered, that he had read something from her ankle that most people would have missed altogether. She dropped her eyes to her notes, but her heart was no longer in her chest. It had moved to her throat. For the first time in 2 years, she couldn't focus. Her mind blurred. Her notes turned to ink without meaning. She tried to forget it by lunch, tried to laugh at herself while stirring powdered creamer into stale coffee in the break room, tried to remind herself that it meant nothing, an accidental moment, a flicker, a glitch in the rhythm of an otherwise quiet life. But the feeling stayed, like a quiet echo in a very loud room. For 2 years, Claire had been invisible, and she preferred it that way. Until now, it wasn't a strategy at first. It was survival. After the accident that took her husband, Claire found herself not so much broken as disassembled, like a porcelain figure knocked off a shelf still mostly whole, but missing something. A corner chipped here, a line of glue barely holding another piece there. She moved gently through her days, afraid a sudden jolt might scatter her all over again. She had her son, Jamie, then just 10, and her mother, whose forgetfulness had started to settle like dust across their shared home. Claire had no time to shatter, no space to grieve loudly, so she learned to become quiet, invisible, almost. And in that quiet, she found work not purpose, not passion, but stability. She was hired as an executive assistant at Maddox and Whitestone, a sleek, eco-focused real estate firm with more glass than walls and more goals than empathy. But it paid well, and it didn't ask too many questions. Claire kept her head down. She didn't wear perfume. She never raised her voice. She knew everyone's birthday, but never shared her own. If she spoke during meetings, it was only to confirm something. If she laughed, it was soft, quick, and easily forgotten. Yet somehow, everything in that office ran smoother because of her. It was an unspoken truth. The emails got answered faster when Claire saw the subject line. The office supplies never ran out. The documents were always where they needed to be, when they needed to be there. She didn't just manage calendars, she managed rhythms, she buffered egos, she redirected tension, she blended in like a backdrop, like wallpaper, like a song you hear every day but don't remember the lyrics to. And that was how she wanted it, because being seen too closely meant being asked questions. And Claire had stopped having answers a long time ago. She lived in a modest home tucked into a cul-de-sac at the edge of town, a 2-bedroom ranch with a creaky porch swing and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. She kept a small vegetable garden, mostly tomatoes and herbs, and watched her mother's TV shows with her every evening after dinner. Jamie, now 12, had grown quieter since middle school started, his world tilting further from hers each month. But he still kissed her on the cheek before bed, still asked if she needed anything when her back ached after a long day, still called her Mom, not Claire, like he sometimes heard other kids do. Claire had once dreamed of becoming a journalist. In college, she'd written essays full of questions about the world, why people lived the way they did, what they were afraid of, what they hoped for. She'd been curious, idealistic. She'd worn oversized sweaters and scribbled in notebooks until her hands ached. Then she met Daniel, and her dreams, like so many others, got folded and tucked into the corners of her life, save for later. A later that never came. Grant Maddox, on the other hand, had always been seen. He moved through the world with the kind of certainty that seemed bred, not taught. At 44, He ran the company with calm authority. His reputation split evenly between brilliance and cold detachment. He rarely smiled in meetings, rarely spoke to anyone outside of direct necessity. He'd divorced 5 years ago, just before Claire joined the firm. No children, no visible companions. He lived alone in a custom home on the northern ridge, designed by some famous architect whose name Claire could never remember. Rumor had it, the house had more windows than walls, and yet, no one really knew him. Their interactions had always been strictly professional. She scheduled his meetings, he thanked her, sometimes with a nod. Their exchanges were clean, swift, and efficient, until the elevator. Since that morning, the moment with the tattoo, something had changed, not publicly. No one else seemed to notice, but Claire did. There was a shift, a pressure, a slight ripple in what had once been still. It wasn't in his words. He didn't start speaking more, but there was something in the way his eyes followed hers, just a fraction longer during meetings. The way his voice hesitated before saying her name, as if trying it out in a new way. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was imagining it. Until that Monday morning meeting, it was quarterly review week. The conference room was packed with department heads, mid-level managers, and project leads. Charts were projected on the screen, numbers filled the room like static. Claire sat in her usual chair, second to last on the right, just out of the main line of sight. She typed quietly, noting who spoke, what deadlines were mentioned, which issues came up more than once. Then, somewhere between a budget discussion and a client forecast, Grant turned his head slightly but clearly and said, "What's your take?" Claire. The room fell silent for a beat. Not awkward, just surprised. Claire blinked. Her fingers froze on the keys. She looked up slowly, expecting to find him looking past her, or at someone else nearby. But his eyes were steady, direct. He was asking her. Claire cleared her throat. Her voice was soft, but even. She spoke about the inconsistency in the data presentation, the need to align phrasing with client priorities, and the lack of clarity in a specific chart. It wasn't revolutionary. It was the kind of observation she'd made dozens of times silently, cleaning up afterward in emails no one saw. But this time, it was heard. Grant nodded once, not dramatically, not performative, but something about that nod felt like a door creaking open. The meeting continued. The moment passed, but Claire could still feel the shape of it in the room, as if her presence had taken on new edges. Afterward, in the kitchen, 2 junior associates whispered near the microwave. Claire didn't hear what they said, but she saw the glance in her direction, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't invisible. That night, after Jamie had gone to bed and her mother had dozed off to the familiar sound of reruns, Claire sat at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm tea. She replayed the meeting over in her head, not the data, not the charts, just the sound of her name on his lips. The way he said it quietly, like it mattered, like it wasn't just a label in a system, but something more personal, something seen. And she wondered more than once what had changed, and why it mattered now. She could feel his gaze before she saw it, like sunlight on the back of her neck, not invasive, not heated, but present like warmth that didn't ask permission to arrive, but didn't demand anything either. In the days after the meeting, the one where Grant had asked for her thoughts in front of everyone, Claire tried to pretend nothing had changed. She still arrived at work at 8:02, still avoided the crowded elevator when she could, still sat in the second-to-last chair at meetings and typed notes no one else would remember. But something had shifted, and it lived in the space between them. It started with the coffee. Claire always made her own medium roast, 1 sugar, no cream, and kept it in a small thermos. But that Thursday morning, when she entered the executive break room, Grant was already there. He stood by the machine, holding 2 ceramic mugs. One was his usual black. No nonsense. The other was hers. She didn't have to ask how he knew. The sugar packet, already torn open and stirred in, told her this wasn't accidental. He handed it to her without a word. Just a small nod, then walked out. The mug was warm in her hand, and something in her chest stirred, uneasy. Then came Monday. Claire wore a pair of vintage pearl drop earrings, tiny, delicate, almost imperceptible beneath her pulled-back hair. They were a gift from her late husband. She wore them on days when she needed to feel stronger. At 11:15 a.m., as she handed Grant a revised contract summary, he paused, his eyes flicked, just for a moment, toward her left ear. "New earrings?" he asked. Claire hesitated, caught off guard. "No, old ones." He nodded again. Nice detail. It was simple, casual, but she carried the weight of it all day, because it wasn't just that he noticed. It was that he remembered, and Claire wasn't used to being remembered. By midweek, she began to sense the office shifting around her, small things. The way two marketing assistants stopped talking when she entered the kitchen, the glances from Laura in accounting too polite, too curious. She knew the signs. Whispers lived in glances long before they found their way to words. Claire had once built a life on being unseen. It was safe, that way. You couldn't be judged if no one remembered you were there. You couldn't disappoint anyone if no one expected more than silence. Now, she felt exposed, not because of anything Grant said or did. He remained polite, measured, distant, but presence was a powerful thing, and his had begun to linger on her like a soft imprint. She tried to shake it off, tried to recede back into her routines, her quiet rituals. She cleaned out the storage closet without being asked, volunteered to summarize a dense project report over the weekend, ate lunch at her desk with her door half closed, but the quiet wasn't quiet anymore. It hummed with something new, a kind of waiting. That Friday, the team gathered in the large boardroom for a client strategy review. Tension filled the space before anyone even sat down. The client, an ambitious, eco-conscious hotel chain, had sent critical feedback overnight. The mood in the room was sharp, defensive. People spoke quickly, numbers flying, fingers pointing gently without names. Grant sat at the head of the table, arms folded, his brow furrowed in thought. Claire sat to the side, typing, listening, filtering. She could feel his mood before he even said anything contained, but simmering. A junior consultant fumbled through a graph explanation. Someone else coughed loudly, as if to interrupt. Claire, under her breath and mostly to herself, muttered, "I've seen toddlers with clearer logic paths." The words slipped out like a sigh, not cruel, not cutting, just tired honesty. And Grant laughed, not a chuckle, not a polite exhale, but a full, deep laugh that cracked through the tension like sunlight through fog. Everyone froze. Claire felt the heat rise up her neck. She hadn't meant to speak. She certainly hadn't meant to amuse him. But Grant was still smiling, head slightly bowed, like someone who'd been holding his breath all week and had finally let it go. The room softened. A few others laughed nervously. The moment passed. The meeting resumed. But something had happened, not just to him, to her. Claire's chest loosened, her spine straightened. She looked up, and for the first time in a very long time, she let herself meet his eyes and hold the gaze. He laughed like he hadn't in years, and she smiled like someone who'd been waiting to. That evening, Claire sat on her back porch with a cup of tea and a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The air smelled like drying leaves and the faint burn of wood smoke from someone's chimney nearby. She could hear her mother watching television through the window. Jamie was in his room, the soft hum of his music leaking through the walls. Claire looked up at the darkening sky. She'd spent years disappearing gently, fading behind obligations, behind motherhood, behind grief. It had become her armor, her disguise, and now, piece by piece, it was peeling, not violently, but like fog dissolving in the morning sun. She wasn't sure what scared her more, being seen again, or wanting it, because being seen meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable meant risking pain. But somewhere inside her, something small and forgotten had begun to wake. He'd never invited her anywhere before, not even to lunch. So, when he said Aspen, she forgot how to breathe. It had been an ordinary Wednesday, wrapped in the same gray light that seemed to cling to late autumn in Colorado Springs. Claire had just finished organizing a budget spreadsheet when Grant stepped into her office. He didn't knock. He rarely did. But this time, he lingered in the doorway, not rushed, not terse, just still. "I have a negotiation meeting in Aspen this weekend," he said. "It's sensitive, and I need someone to keep notes, someone I trust." Claire blinked. He could have chosen any of the project managers, or flown someone in. There was no shortage of capable people around him, but he had chosen her. "I understand it's short notice," he added. "We'd leave Friday afternoon, back Sunday evening." She nodded, too quickly. "The movement automatic?" "Of course. I'll arrange my schedule." He paused for half a second, then nodded once before turning away. No further explanation, no small talk, just that. The door clicked shut behind him, and Claire sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the cursor blinking on her screen. She packed lightly, 2 blouses, a sweater, and a wool coat she hadn't worn in years. Jamie would be at his friend's house for the weekend, and her mother's part-time caregiver had agreed to stay overnight. It had all fallen into place too easily, as if the weekend had been waiting for her all along. The drive to Aspen was long, but quiet. Snow had begun to dust the mountains, and the sky carried that soft, pre-winter hush that makes everything feel suspended. Grant drove steadily, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift. Claire sat beside him, her notebook closed in her lap, unsure how to fill the silence. Until he asked, "Is the tattoo new?" She turned, caught off guard. "No," she said softly. "It's old, from a different life." Grant didn't press, but his silence felt like an invitation, not a demand, but a space held open. Claire looked out at the highway, the pines rolling past like a procession. "My husband died 3 years ago. He always reminded me that I was more than the roles I filled, the wife, the mother, the daughter. He saw me before I knew how to see myself." The tattoo was his idea. Grant's hands tightened slightly on the wheel, but he said nothing. And that, too, was something. They didn't speak again for miles, but it wasn't the strained silence of 2 people uncomfortable with one another. It was quieter than that, gentler. When they arrived at the hotel, an elegant yet modest resort tucked into the edge of a snowy ridge, Claire stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply. The air here was thinner, crisper, like truth lived closer to the surface. At the front desk, something went wrong with her room. Heating system malfunction. Maintenance was delayed. The receptionist apologized profusely. "We have a connected suite available," she said, her smile slightly strained. 2 rooms, joined by an interior door. "Will that be all right?" Claire hesitated, looking toward Grant. He simply nodded. "It's fine." The suite was quiet, almost too quiet. Claire's room was warm and spare a bed dressed in soft flannel, a reading chair by the fireplace, a sliding door that led out to a narrow balcony. The connecting door between their rooms remained closed, but its presence hummed quietly, as if reminding her she wasn't alone. She didn't see him again until later that evening. Claire had been reading in her chair, feet tucked beneath her, when the sudden cold called her outside. The sky was dark now, stars spilling across it with the kind of indifference that makes you feel both small and held. She stepped onto the balcony, pulling her sweater tighter around her shoulders. The mountains loomed in the distance, silent, timeless, watching. A moment later, she heard the soft creak of the door next to hers. Grant appeared on his own balcony, coat draped over one arm, something in his hand. He said nothing, just stepped closer to the low railing and extended the item across the short distance between them. It was a scarf, deep green, cashmere, worn at the edges, but still elegant. Claire took it slowly, her fingers brushing his. The fabric was soft, too familiar. Her throat closed. Her husband had worn one just like it. The same shade, the same feel. She'd bought it for him the winter before the accident. She didn't speak, couldn't. The tears came without ceremony, not loud, not sharp, just slow and full, like rain soaking into earth that had been dry for too long. Grant didn't move. He didn't reach for her. He just stood beside her, separated only by a few feet of air and years of unspoken stories. Claire wiped her cheek with the edge of her sleeve, then clutched the scarf gently. "It's silly," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's just fabric." But it wasn't. He didn't reply, and that, too, was the right thing. They stood like that for a long time, each facing the mountains, the cold brushing their faces, their breath visible in the dark. No confessions, no probing questions. Just two people carrying quiet things beside one another. And in that moment, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. Not because someone had protected her, but because someone had seen the pieces of her that were fragile and hadn't looked away. Later, as she lay in bed, the scarf still draped over the footboard, Claire stared at the ceiling and let her mind replay the silence between them. It was strange, she thought, how the most meaningful moments rarely arrived with fanfare. Not love, not yet, but something close, something that didn't need to be named to be real. She stood by the door that connected their rooms, hand on the knob, heart in her throat. It was just a door, a simple, painted panel with a brass handle and a latch no different than 1,000 others she'd opened in her life. But tonight, it felt like the thinnest wall between what was and what could be. Claire didn't open it. Instead, she pulled the scarf tighter around her shoulders and stepped back. She had promised herself not to move too fast, not to let emotion fill in the blanks that life had left empty. Not again. The next morning, the light through the mountain window was soft and reluctant. Claire rose early, as always, her hands moving through practice motions, brushing her hair, folding the extra blanket, warming her hands on the porcelain mug of hotel coffee. When she stepped into the conference room that afternoon, it was as though the night before had been wrapped up and placed in a drawer. Grant greeted her with a nod. Nothing more. His voice was firm, steady. The negotiation went well. The clients were polite but firm. Claire kept notes in her quiet shorthand, capturing key phrases and subtle changes in tone. When the financial consultant fumbled over a proposed clause, Grant didn't jump in. Instead, he turned to Claire. "Can you walk them through the revised section?" It wasn't a question, not really. It was trust, handed to her in the middle of a high-stakes table. Claire cleared her throat gently and explained the clause, why they'd adjusted the language, how it would affect liability, and why it benefited both parties long-term. Her voice didn't tremble, not this time. When she finished, one of the senior partners nodded in appreciation. The conversation moved on. No one clapped. There were no lingering glances, but Claire felt it. The line between assistant and equal had blurred, however briefly. Still, when the meeting ended, she gathered her notes quickly, careful not to linger. On the drive back, the sun was already low, casting long golden slants across the road. The silence between them felt heavier, this time, not tense, but full, until Grant's phone rang. He tapped his Bluetooth earpiece and answered with a neutral, "Go ahead!" Claire didn't listen on purpose, but voices filled small spaces. The voice on the other end was female, soft, familiar, easy. Someone who called him by his first name without hesitation. She laughed once, lightly, asked if he'd be back in time for the dinner reservation, said she'd saved the table in the corner for them. Grant answered simply, "We'll see. I'll call you later." Claire stared out the window, her eyes fixed on the blur of evergreens. She didn't speak, didn't ask. She just sat with the sudden awareness that whatever she thought she'd felt, she had felt alone. The rest of the ride was quiet. They pulled into the company parking lot just after sunset. Grant opened her door, handed her a small folder she'd left behind in Aspen. And then, like every other day before the mountains, he said, "Good night, Claire." She nodded. Good night. No mention of the scarf, no echo of the balcony, no trace of warmth. As if nothing had happened, as if it had only existed between her and the silence. That night, after Jamie had gone to bed and her mother had dozed off in her chair, Claire opened her laptop to organize the meeting notes. There, in her inbox, was an email from him. Subject line, "Just us message. You're the only one I trust with the truth. G." There were no attachments, no explanation, just those 11 words. She stared at it for nearly 10 minutes, reading it once, then again, then a third time, aloud, under her breath. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't reply. She closed the laptop, then opened it again, then slowly clicked delete, and cried, not because she was hurt, not because she was angry, but because she'd let herself hope, and hope, she'd learned, was the most dangerous thing of all. She didn't sleep that night. She watched the shadows on her bedroom wall shift as headlights passed, listened to the slow ticking of the clock in the hallway, counted the breaths between her own doubts. Had she imagined it all, the way he'd looked at her, the scarf, the balcony silence, or had she mistaken kindness for something else? Her heart kept whispering one thing, but her head was louder now, and what it said was, "This is not your story." Not again. The next morning, Claire arrived at work 15 minutes early. She sat in her car for a while, watching the fog lift from the street lamps. Her thermos sat in the cup holder, untouched. Inside the building, she walked with deliberate steps. When she passed his office, the door was open. He was on a call, standing by the window, back turned. She didn't pause, didn't knock. She went straight to her desk, and for the rest of the day, she was the Claire Whitman she'd always been: efficient, precise, invisible, but inside, something had cracked. Not broken, not shattered, just cracked. And through that crack, doubt poured in. Had she crossed a line? Had she imagined there even was a line? She had spent so many years building walls, only to find herself reaching for a door. And now, that door felt like a mistake. That night, she stood in the bathroom, brushing her hair, the overhead light flickering faintly above. She looked at her reflection and whispered, "You're not a fool. You just wanted to feel again." She traced the edge of the tattoo near her ankle, the words now half faded. "You are more than what they see." But what if what they saw wasn't real? She knew she had to draw a line, not for him, not out of pride, but for herself, because it was too easy to fall into stories that didn't belong to her, too easy to become a supporting character in someone else's life. So she drew it, silently, firmly, without ceremony. She didn't avoid him, but she didn't linger either. She answered his emails. She organized his meetings. She smiled in passing, but the quiet between them returned. Not the soft, curious kind, the old kind, the safe kind. And yet, every time she walked past his office, she felt it, the pause in his voice, the glance that didn't quite reach her, something unspoken, something unfinished. She had drawn the line for both of them, but he was already on the other side, waiting. And what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the woman on the phone wasn't his lover. Not anymore. She was the last piece of a chapter Grant had been trying to close, and he had sent that email not as an invitation, but as a confession. It started with a whisper, and like most whispers, it grew teeth. It came quietly at first, just a shift in tone, a pause in conversation when Claire walked into the break room, a look quickly hidden, a question asked too casually. She noticed it on Tuesday morning. There was a hum in the air, subtle but sharp. Laura from accounting didn't return her smile. Mike, who always held the elevator door for her, let it close instead. The HR assistant who used to chat about weekend markets suddenly avoided her eye. Claire told herself it was nothing. Office fatigue, coincidence, a mood she hadn't picked up on. But whispers leave a scent, and once you've caught it, it's hard to forget. By Thursday, it wasn't just whispers. It was an email, sent anonymously to the HR department and CC'd to the board. Allegations that Claire Whitman had developed an inappropriate personal relationship with the CEO, that her proximity to leadership gave her unfair influence, that her recent project visibility and growing presence in leadership meetings was suspicious, that she had compromised professional boundaries. The language was polished, clinical, no rage, just implication, enough to plant a seed, enough to fracture what had once been quiet. She was called into a meeting at 4:30 that afternoon. 2 HR representatives, 1 board liaison, 1 closed door. They were kind. That was the worst part. Smiles like blankets, voices like warm water. It's not a formal accusation, they said. Just a precaution, a temporary leave of absence while we look into the matter. Not punitive, just protocol. Transparency is vital at this level of the company. You understand? Of course. Claire didn't cry. She didn't ask who had sent it, didn't ask what evidence they had, didn't ask why her record 2 spotless years of diligence and grace suddenly mattered less than 1 shadowy email. She just nodded. She understood too well. Sometimes, silence isn't safety. Sometimes, it becomes an empty space others fill with their own versions of you. Grant found out that night. She didn't hear it from him directly, but through the receptionist who passed her in the lobby. He looked like thunder, she whispered, eyes wide. Slammed the boardroom door so hard the wall shook. But thunder, Claire knew, made noise, not change. He didn't call, not that night, not the next day. She knew why: pressure, optics, reputation. He had a company to protect, and she had herself. So, that Friday morning, Claire came in early. The office was quiet, lights dimmed, hallways still. She packed her things slowly. A ceramic mug, a folder of her son's sketches, the small wooden clock Daniel had bought her at a roadside market years ago. She wrapped it in a scarf, his scarf folded carefully at the bottom of the drawer since Aspen. She left the office plant, the one with leaves that always tilted toward the sun. Someone else would water it now, but she took the photo of her and Jamie, him, in his Halloween astronaut costume, her kneeling beside him, both mid-laugh. Some things were still hers to keep. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she drove past the grocery store, past the elementary school, past the worn-out diner with the best cherry pie in town. She drove until the streets thinned and the air got colder, until she reached the cemetery on the edge of town. Daniel's headstone was simple, slate gray. No dates on the front, just his name and a line from a song he used to hum while washing dishes. Even the quiet things have a tune. Claire sat down on the bench nearby, her coat drawn tight, the box of her belongings at her feet. She hadn't visited in months. Life, grief, motherhood, work, they all made excuses. But now, sitting there, she realized it wasn't time that had kept her away. It was shame. Because even 3 years later, some part of her still felt like she'd failed at moving on. Or worse, felt guilty for even trying. I met someone, she said aloud, eyes on the stone. The wind didn't answer, but she kept speaking, slow and unsure, as if he could interrupt. He's not you. He's quiet in a way that listens. He notices things, small things. He gave me a scarf, and I cried. Not because it was romantic, but because it reminded me that being remembered can feel like coming home. Her voice cracked. I didn't cross any lines. I was careful. Too careful. Probably. But it didn't matter. The world sees what it wants. They always do. She looked down at her hands, soft lines of age and work, of dishes washed and papers filed, of holding too much and letting go too little. I didn't defend myself. Not because I was guilty, but because I was tired. Claire sat there for a long time, her breath fogging in the air, the silence stretching around her like a soft quilt. She didn't cry loudly, just let the weight settle. Because sometimes healing isn't loud. Sometimes it's just sitting still long enough to feel again. and as she stood to leave, brushing dirt from her skirt, she felt something unfamiliar settle quietly in her chest. Not peace, but something like resolve. That night, she made soup. Not the canned kind, but real soup onions and carrots sautéed until golden, broth warmed slow, thyme from her own garden. She set the table for 3. Jamie, her mother, herself, 3 bowls, 3 spoons, a moment of normal. When Jamie asked why she was home early, she smiled. Just taking a few days off. She said, "It's time." She didn't explain more. Some truths don't need to be explained right away. Some truths live in small things. Soup simmering, hands washed, candles lit. Later, she opened her laptop, scanned the folders she had saved from the office, drafts, plans, writing prompts she'd collected over the years, notes she'd once jotted in the corners of spreadsheets, snippets of dialogue, essay ideas, half-written articles. She opened a new document, typed a title, then deleted it, started again. How to disappear and still remain whole. She wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long time, the not knowing didn't feel like drowning. It felt like space, and maybe, just maybe, space was a kind of beginning too. And in his corner office, Grant sat staring at an empty inbox, her email signature gone, her calendar blank, her absence louder than any accusation. He didn't know where she had gone, but he knew he hadn't tried hard enough to stop her. And maybe that was the truth no one had the courage to whisper. He didn't try to stop her, not with words, but silence sometimes speaks louder than anything. When Claire walked out the Friday afternoon, box in hand, the world didn't pause. The elevators still dinged, keyboards still clicked, phones still rang with urgency that never quite reached the soul. But something had shifted in the air, subtle, hollow. Grant Maddox didn't follow her, didn't send a message, didn't make a phone call that night. Not the next day, not the next week. He said nothing, and perhaps that's what hurt the most. The office moved on. That's what offices do. A new assistant arrived the following Monday, neatly dressed, efficient, younger. She sat at Claire's old desk, filled her drawers with pens that matched, drank her coffee with sweetener instead of sugar. But the rhythm was off. The new assistant greeted Grant each morning with a cheerful, "Good to see you, Sir and Grant." Every time, only nodded, distracted, already halfway through. A thought he didn't speak aloud. He missed his meetings more often now. His calendar, once sacred, grew uneven, dotted with last-minute cancellations and unexplained gaps. The board noticed, HR noticed, but no one said much, because Grant Maddox had always been a man of few words. And now, he simply became fewer. In her small kitchen across town, Claire stirred soup slowly, watching the bubbles rise and break like breath. Her mother watched reruns on the living room TV. Jamie sat at the counter doing homework, humming under his breath. And in the quiet, this new quiet, Claire realized something unexpected. She wasn't afraid of silence anymore. It didn't swallow her. It didn't echo with loss. It just was soft, spacious, hers. She organized the hall closet, cleaned out the garage, read 3 books cover to cover, replanted her herb garden, called an old friend she hadn't spoken to in years, sent out 2 job applications not because she needed to move fast, but because she could. But there were moments, late at night, when the house was still and her breath was loud, that she thought about the door between the rooms in Aspen, about the scarf, about the man who had watched her speak in a boardroom full of men and smiled like he saw her for the first time. And she asked herself the question that wouldn't let go: was his silence rejection? Or fear one afternoon? Claire met up with John, an old friend of Daniel's. They hadn't spoken since the funeral. He had been Daniel's college roommate and, oddly, one of the few people who truly understood what Claire had lost. They sat in a quiet cafe, sipping lukewarm coffee and reminiscing with the ease of people who had survived the same grief. "You seem lighter," John said, squinting at her thoughtfully, like someone finally turned off the static. Claire smiled. I feel clearer, but not always calm. He chuckled. That's grief. It doesn't leave. It just stops screaming. They talked for an hour, maybe two. As she stood to leave, John reached into his jacket and pulled out a small USB drive. I meant to send you this, he said. Back in January, Grant Maddox gave a talk for our internal leadership series. I helped organize them. Didn't know you two even worked together until someone mentioned it. Claire blinked. You know Grant? John shrugged, only professionally. But he surprised me in that session. Not because of what he said, but because he didn't say much until this one moment. He tapped the drive. I time-stamped it. Claire took it, unsure what it meant to her yet, but she thanked him. Anyway, that night, when the house was asleep, she plugged the drive into her laptop, opened the file, scrolled to the timestamp. There he was, on screen, in a quiet conference room, wearing the navy blazer she always thought made him look younger. He was standing, not at a podium, but near a whiteboard, arms crossed, posture relaxed, eyes not looking at the camera, but slightly to the side as if unsure he wanted to be seen. He was talking about leadership, about quiet influence, about the pressure to speak, even when silence might be wiser. And then, at minute 37, he paused, looked down, and said, almost too softly, I'm not good at saying what I care about most. I've spent most of my life avoiding the things I wasn't sure I could protect, but silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's just fear dressed as discipline. Claire froze. The words weren't polished, not rehearsed, but they were real. He hadn't said her name, hadn't mentioned anything specific, but she knew. He wasn't just a boss. He was a man who had lost his words somewhere along the way, just like she had. She didn't cry. Not this time. She just sat there, hand resting on the edge of the keyboard, watching him fade into the next speaker. Then she closed the laptop and saved the clip. Not to replay it, not to analyze it, but to remember that maybe his silence had never meant no. It had meant, I don't know how. That night, as wind moved through the trees outside her window, Claire lay awake with a strange calm. Some stories don't need an ending to be meaningful. Some doors don't have to open to change your direction. And some men speak the loudest. By not speaking at all, she wrote him letters, dozens. None of them were mailed. They began quietly, almost without intention. One sleepless night. Claire reached for the worn notebook she kept in her bedside drawer, the one Daniel had given her their first Christmas together. The cover was frayed now, corners soft with time, pages still blank in the middle. She opened to a fresh sheet, picked up a pen, and wrote, Dear Grant, you probably don't even know the color of the mug I used every morning, but I noticed yours. Always black, no sugar, just heat and intention. That first letter was only a page long. She didn't plan to write another, but the next night, she did, and the next. The letters weren't love confessions. Not exactly. They were fragments of memories, of observations, of silences she'd never known how to fill. She wrote about the first time he said her name in a room full of men, the moment he handed her the scarf in Aspen, the way his voice softened when he didn't know anyone was listening, the gap between what they felt and what they allowed. Some letters were short, just a paragraph. Others spanned 4 or 5 pages, meandering through thoughts like rivers without maps. She never reread them. She folded each one carefully, dated it, and tucked it inside a shoebox beneath her bed. It wasn't for him. It was for her. A way to sort through the ache without drowning in it. Around the same time, Claire started volunteering. It had been Jamie's idea, oddly enough. His teacher had given a talk about intergenerational storytelling, how young people could learn from the elderly, and vice versa. Jamie had come home that day, eyes bright. You should do it, Mom, he said. You're always writing. Maybe you could help people tell their stories. Claire smiled, thinking it was a passing thought. But 2 weeks later, She walked into the small, sunlit office of the Listening Room, a non-profit that helped seniors write down their life stories for their families. Claire became a writing assistant. Once a week, she'd sit across from someone in their 70s, 80s, even 90s, and just listen. Then she'd help them turn memories into something tangible. One of her favorite storytellers was a man named Harold, 84, a retired postman, 2 heart attacks, 1 hip replacement, 3 grandkids. He had a slow, deliberate way of speaking, like each word was a stone he needed to turn over before giving it away. One afternoon, as they were working on a story about his late wife, Harold paused mid-sentence. "You know," he said, setting down his pen, "I almost lost her once. Spent 6 months thinking she didn't love me anymore." Claire looked up. "What changed?" He chuckled. "Nothing. That's the problem. Neither of us said a damn thing. We were both too proud, or scared, or tired." He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. "You can't wait forever for someone to say it," he said. "Sometimes you have to say it first." That night, Claire came home and stared at the shoebox under her bed. She opened it, ran her fingers over the stack of folded paper. Then she began to tear them, one by one. No ceremony, no regret. Just a quiet goodbye to every word she hadn't dared speak aloud. It took time. She paused only once on a letter written 3 weeks earlier. It wasn't long, barely 2 paragraphs, but something in it felt still. "Dear Grant, I think I'm finally beginning to understand that silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's just grief, learning to breathe again after something unnamed leaves the room. You don't owe me anything. But if you ever wonder where I went, I didn't run. I just stopped waiting for a door that wouldn't open." She didn't tear that one. Instead, she slid it into the back pocket of a notebook, the same one she took to her volunteer work, tucked it deep between lined pages filled with someone else's stories, a quiet keepsake, not because she planned to send it, but because some things are worth being found, even if only by accident, even if only one day. In the mornings, she still missed him, not in the sweeping, dramatic way books described, but in small details, like the way she used to time her coffee break by the sound of his office door, or how she still checked her inbox at 7:13 a.m., the minute he usually sent his first message. But slowly, day by day, she missed herself less. The version of Claire, who had once disappeared behind others' needs, was beginning to reappear. She laughed more, sang in the car again, wore earrings just because they jingled. She remembered things she'd once written in the margins of her college notebooks, "Write what isn't being said." Some silences deserve voice. And still, some nights, she would trace the edges of that one saved letter and wonder, what would have happened if I said something first, but she didn't drown in it anymore? Now, the question sat beside her like an old friend unanswered, but no longer haunting. Spring began to show itself quietly. A few early crocuses poking through the garden soil, mornings that smelled like thawing earth. Claire opened her windows more. She let light in, let wind move the curtains, let possibility feel less like a betrayal of the past, and more like a tribute to it. She no longer needed to send the letter, but she needed to know that one day he might find it. Her voice shook, but it didn't break, and for the first time in years, people listened. The auditorium was small, intimate, red chairs, soft lighting, the kind of space that felt more like a whisper than a declaration. Claire stood backstage, her note cards trembling in her hand, though she knew she wouldn't look at them. She had memorized every word. Still, it wasn't the words that scared her. It was the silence before she spoke the way the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if she would. 3 months ago, she never would have said yes. But when the invitation came, Claire Whitman, would you consider sharing at our upcoming TEDx on being seen? Something inside her didn't flinch. Maybe because she'd spent too long hiding. Maybe because she was ready to stop. Maybe because there were things she needed to say, not just to the world, but to herself. She had written the talk in one sitting, didn't show it to anyone, didn't ask for feedback. She knew this one wasn't for editing. She stepped out under the soft spotlight. The audience was quiet, expectant. She adjusted the mic, cleared her throat, and began. I spent most of my adult life being the kind of person who blended in, not because I lacked ideas or presence, but because somewhere along the way, I believed I had to earn the right to be seen. And that bar kept moving. A murmur of recognition moved through the room. She saw nods, folded hands, leaning shoulders. She took a breath. I used to think invisibility was safety, that if I kept things smooth, kept the machine running, no one would question whether I belonged. Her voice wavered, just slightly, but then someone looked at me, not in the way people glance past you, but in the way that says, I see you. She didn't say his name, never would, but he was in every syllable. In that moment, I remembered I was a whole person, not a role, not a title, not a placeholder for someone more important. At Gate 22 of the Denver airport, Grant Maddox sat alone, waiting for a delayed flight to San Francisco. He was scrolling aimlessly through his phone when a headline caught his eye. Local TEDx speaker goes viral with talk on invisibility, grief, and being seen. The thumbnail image was blurry, but it was her, Claire. He tapped. The clip began with her standing beneath soft lights, hair tucked behind one ear, hands lightly clasped, gaze calm but piercing. He turned up the volume. I didn't know how much I needed to be seen until someone did it without asking for anything in return. She said, I didn't fall in love. That's not what this is. What I fell into was remembrance of my own worth, of what it felt like to matter. Grant's screen blurred. He blinked fast, but the ache came anyway, sharp, real, quiet. The way she spoke so still, so certain it undid something in him. And then she said it. Sometimes we don't need someone to fix us. We just need them to see us and stay. The auditorium held its breath. So did Gate 22. Grant closed his eyes, his hand over his mouth, and for the first time since she left, he cried. Not because of regret, not even because of loss, but because he finally heard her, truly heard her. Back on stage. Claire paused. She could feel her heart racing, but her voice stayed steady now. The fear had passed. Invisibility is quiet, but being seen, being truly seen, is loud in the soul. She smiled gently, not the kind meant for applause, but the kind you give yourself after carrying something heavy for too long and finally setting it down. She ended her talk without flourish. No grand gesture, no dramatic bow, just a long pause, a silence that filled the room with something tender, not finality, but peace. The applause came eventually warm, standing, whole, but Claire barely heard it. She walked off stage slowly, her hands relaxed at her sides, her chest full of breath, and something else, too, release. Later that night, as she stood in her kitchen pouring tea, Jamie ran in, waving his phone. Mom, you're on the internet, like, everywhere. The video already has 500,000 views. Claire laughed, truly laughed, not at the number, but at the idea that something so quiet could be heard so loudly. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and said, well, I guess someone was listening. And in a hotel room in San Francisco, with the city lights stretching beyond his window, Grant rewatched the talk again. This time, not as a CEO, not as a man who'd once stood silent on a balcony beside her, but as someone who finally understood that his silence had a sound after all. She hadn't seen his name in 6 months. Until the package arrived, it was an ordinary Thursday, the kind with laundry half folded on the couch, a simmering pot of soup on the stove, and the distant sound of Jamie's laughter from the living room. Claire was rinsing mugs when the doorbell rang. She wiped her hands on a towel, walked to the porch, and opened the door. A small brown parcel sat on the welcome mat. No return address. Just her name written in careful, familiar handwriting that made her breath catch. She brought it inside. sat at the table, and for a moment, didn't open it. The wrapping was simple: brown craft paper, thin twine, no tape. It unfolded easily, like something meant to be opened slowly. Inside was a book, hardcover, handmade, no title on the front, no author's name, just deep navy blue, with a fabric spine and a single silver ribbon tucked inside. Claire ran her fingers across the cover, then opened it. On the first page, handwritten in black ink for the woman who made me believe again. G. Her hands trembled. She turned the next page, and there it was. His voice not in speech, not in silence, but in story. The pages weren't printed, they were written, neat handwriting, slightly slanted, with occasional smudges and crossed-out words that somehow made it more real. It wasn't a memoir, not quite a novel either. It was moments, memories, reflections, vignettes of a man learning how to feel again. Some pages were short, others were long. Some were nothing more than a sentence: "Grief doesn't end, it just changes seats at the table." Silence was the language I thought I had to speak until her laughter taught me otherwise. Claire read slowly, like she might miss something if she blinked too long. Because it wasn't just a book, it was a map. Of the man she had only ever glimpsed behind boardroom walls and winter scarves and held breath. Halfway through, something slipped from the pages. She reached down, a folded letter, cream-colored, worn at the creases, her handwriting. Claire froze. It was the letter. Her letter, the only one she hadn't torn. The one she had tucked inside the back pocket of a notebook and left in the bottom drawer of her desk the day she packed up. She thought she had left it behind. Apparently, he hadn't. Her fingers unfolded it slowly. She didn't need to read it. She remembered every word, but she read it anyway. I think I'm finally beginning to understand that silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's just grief. Learning to breathe again after something unnamed leaves the room. You don't owe me anything. But if you ever wonder where I went, I didn't run. I just stopped waiting for a door that wouldn't open. Claire exhaled, not a sob, not a gasp, just breath, steady, whole. She leaned back in her chair, book in her lap, letter resting on her palm like a truth finally returned. The room was quiet, but not hollow. She looked around, the steam rising gently from the pot, the sun filtering in through the kitchen curtains, the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. Life, still happening, and in the middle of it, this strange, quiet bridge between what was and what might still be. She turned back to the book, near the end. A line stood alone on a page. I wrote this, not because I thought she'd read it, but because I needed to remember who I became, because she existed. Claire closed her eyes. There was no proposal in these pages, no grand promise, no plea for reunion, just presence, an offering. The way someone might leave a lantern in the window, not knowing if anyone is coming, but hoping they'll find their way home if they do. She didn't call him, didn't rush to reply. Instead, she placed the book on the nightstand beside her bed and placed the letter back between the pages, where it belonged, not sent, not lost, just waiting. That night, as she tucked Jamie into bed, he looked up at her with the unfiltered eyes of a 12-year-old. "You look different," he said, frowning slightly. Claire smiled. "How so? I don't know. Like, you know something the rest of us don't." She kissed his forehead. "Maybe I do." And as she turned off the light and closed the door, she realized he was right. She did know something. She knew that sometimes. Words don't need to be shouted to be heard. Sometimes, a book with no title says everything that needed to be said. And somewhere miles away, in a quiet house tucked behind tall trees, Grant Maddox sat at his kitchen table, staring at an empty mug, waiting, but not with urgency, with hope. Because when you finally said what needed saying, and you've heard what needed hearing, all that's left is the space between, and sometimes that's where love begins again. It was the same hotel, the same mountains, but she was different now. Claire stepped out of the rental car just past noon. The air in Aspen still held that high-altitude crispness, cooler, cleaner, as if every breath here had been filtered through a pine tree. The sky was impossibly clear, just like last time. But unlike last time, she hadn't come for work. She hadn't come for him. She came for something unfinished. The navy blue book lay in her tote bag, tucked between a scarf and a well-worn notebook. No return address, no invitation, no plan. Just a pull. The lobby hadn't changed, still framed in dark wood and soft amber lighting, still quiet enough that the sound of her boots on the floor felt louder than expected. She didn't ask for a room. She just walked, past the front desk, down the corridor, toward the same floor, the same wing, the same view. And when she reached the suite balcony, yes, that balcony, she stepped outside and closed her eyes. It smelled like cedar, like memory. Claire placed her hand gently on the metal railing and breathed. She didn't hear the door behind her, but she heard his voice, low, familiar, slightly cracked at the edges. I wondered if you'd come. She didn't turn around right away. Let the wind fill the silence between them. Then she turned. Grant Maddox stood just inside the doorway. Same dark coat, same unreadable expression, but in his hands, he held a copy of the same book she had brought. Navy blue, no title. Their silences matched. Neither moved to close the distance. Claire nodded toward his copy. You kept one too? He gave a small smile. I made 3. One to send, one to keep, and one I kept in case you ever wanted to talk. She laughed just a breath of it. So, we're both terrible at saying things directly. Grant stepped outside, standing beside her, not too close. I think that's why I needed to write it. They both looked out at the mountains, now tinged with the pink and gold of late afternoon. No words, just the comfort of shared quiet. After a while, Claire broke it. Why Aspen? He didn't hesitate, because this is where I stopped pretending I didn't feel something. She looked down, brushing her fingers along the book's spine. I wasn't ready then, I know. He glanced at her. You are now. Claire met his gaze. I don't know if I'm ready for everything, but I'm ready not to hide. Grant nodded, slowly, like he understood every layer of what she meant. They sat down side by side on the bench overlooking the valley. Claire opened the book and flipped to the page with the line he had written. I wrote this not because I thought she'd read it, but because I needed to remember who I became, because she existed. She whispered, Did you really become someone else? No, Grant said, voice soft. I just finally saw the man I'd buried under achievement and silence. And you saw him first. Claire didn't reply right away, but the tears that touched the corners of her eyes said enough. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something she hadn't seen in a long time. A silver pen, the same kind she used to refill every quarter. He turned the book over in his lap and began writing on the inside back cover. Claire watched, curious, but didn't ask. When he finished, he handed the book back to her. She turned it over. 4 words. In his unmistakable handwriting, this is our chapter. The moment lingered longer than any other moment they'd shared before. Not heavy, not rushed, just full of history, of choices, of all the things that hadn't been said, now sitting quietly between them. Forgiven. I'm not asking for anything, Grant said finally. Not a restart, not an answer. Claire looked at him. I know. He took a breath. But if you ever feel like turning a page, just know I'll be reading too. She smiled. Not the kind you offer out of politeness, but the kind born from healing and truth and love that doesn't demand, only exists. As the sun dipped lower behind the peaks, painting the sky in ribbons of lavender and gold, they stood together, shoulder to shoulder, no hand-holding, no promises, just presence. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. He turned to her once more. You made me write again, he said. That's how I knew it was real. Claire didn't cry, not because she wasn't moved, but because for the first time, the feeling didn't need to escape her. It was safe where it lived now. It belonged, and just like that, two quiet lives found one loud moment of truth. The slip had passed, the season had changed, but his gaze remained. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind that moved slowly enough for small rituals to matter. Claire sat by the window of a little cafe tucked just off Main Street brick walls, wooden beams, and the kind of lighting that made even silence feel warm. She stirred her coffee without urgency, watching the snow begin to fall, flake by flake, like the world had finally decided to hush itself. Across from her, Grant sat with a paperback in one hand, his other resting loosely around a warm mug. No briefcase, no laptop, no meetings waiting, just this. They hadn't spoken much that morning. They didn't need to. The last few months had shifted something between them, not in bold strokes, but in the kind of quiet that changes the shape of a room without anyone moving a thing. They hadn't gone back to their old roles. Claire didn't return to the firm. Grant didn't ask her to. Instead, they had both moved outward, not toward each other, but beside. Claire began writing, not just letters or fragments, but full pages, chapters, stories that once lived in her chest now found their way onto paper. The working title for her first book was a question she never got to ask out loud. What if being seen was enough? Grant, in turn, had begun investing not in buildings or mergers, but in the nonprofit where Claire volunteered, quiet donations, strategic guidance, and sometimes just showing up to sit in the back of storytelling sessions. They had found their way back to presence, not control, and that had made all the difference. The cafe was almost empty, save for a couple in the corner and the soft hum of a jazz track playing through old speakers. Claire set her spoon down. "Can I ask you something?" Grant looked up from his book. She smiled. "Just a little. When did you know he didn't need her to clarify?" He closed the book gently, fingers resting on the cover. There was a pause, not the awkward kind, but the honest kind, the kind that holds the weight of real remembering. "The day you slipped," he said softly, "and I saw the part of you no one else ever did." Claire felt something warm rise in her chest, not embarrassment, not surprise, but recognition. "You mean the tattoo?" she asked, almost teasing. Grant shook his head, then nodded once. "Not just that. That was just the door. What I saw was the way you held yourself every day. The way you disappeared just enough to keep everything moving, while hoping no one would ask if you were okay." He looked at her fully now. "And then, in that second, you couldn't disappear. And I saw you." She looked down at her coffee. "I didn't think anyone noticed." "I did." His voice was quiet, but there was nothing hesitant in it, and I haven't stopped noticing since. Claire's fingers brushed the rim of her cup. "It scared me," she admitted, "not just being seen, but the idea that maybe I was worth being seen." Grant leaned forward slightly. "I think we both had to learn how to believe that." They sat in silence again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of all the versions of themselves they had once been, and all the versions they were becoming. When the snow began to fall more steadily, Claire turned her gaze outside. The streets were softening into white. Cars moved slower. People tugged scarves tighter. The world was tucking itself in. She stood. Grant followed. They stepped outside, into the soft hush of winter. The cold met them gently just enough to make the breath visible. The hands instinctively find pockets. They didn't hold hands. They didn't kiss. But they walked side by side, footsteps falling in rhythm, a quiet knowing hanging in the air between them. Not everything needed to be spoken to be understood. At the corner, they paused. Claire looked at him. "I used to think it would take something dramatic, some grand gesture to fix what I'd lost." Grant waited, eyes steady. "But now," she said, "I think all I ever needed was someone to see me and stay." He didn't respond with words, just held her gaze long, full, unflinching. the same gaze he had given her once in a hallway, when a slip of fabric and a sliver of ink had changed everything. Only now, it wasn't curiosity or quiet surprise in his eyes. It was recognition, belief, and something that had no name but needed none. They didn't talk about the future, didn't make promises, didn't try to name what they were. They just stood in the snow, letting the world move quietly around them. And when Claire finally turned to walk back toward the cafe, she felt it not behind her, but beside her, the presence, the steadiness, the gaze that had never truly left. Because sometimes, it only takes 1 second to change how someone sees you, but it takes courage to believe them and stay. Sometimes, the most powerful moments in our lives aren't loud. They're quiet, subtle, almost invisible, a glance, a kind word, someone noticing what others overlook. Claire's story reminds us that being seen, truly seen, is one of the deepest human needs. Not for perfection, not for attention, but to be understood without having to explain ourselves. In a world that often moves too fast, many of us learn to hide behind roles, routines, and silence. But healing begins when someone looks past what we present and sees who we are underneath. The story also teaches us that timing matters. That love, connection, and even second chances don't always arrive when we want them to, but when we're finally ready to receive them. And perhaps the most important lesson of all, you are more than what they see. You always have been. So, take up space, speak your truth, allow yourself to be visible not for the world's applause, but for your own peace. Because sometimes, the softest moments leave the loudest echo. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, reminded you of something you've lost or something you found, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing to our channel for more stories that speak softly, but stay long after. Your presence here means more than you know. Until next time, take care, and keep believing in quiet miracles.